An aquifer is an underground location that can be used to produce a productive amount of water supply at the surface. So if there's water below the surface of the ground that you can productively pump out of the ground and use, that's considered an aquifer. If there's not enough water down there to use, then it's not an aquifer. What I like to think of it as is like a bathtub, and you take the bathtub and you fill it up with broken pieces of concrete sidewalk. You could still put water in the bathtub because the water would trickle down and it would fill those gaps where rough edges were contacting each other, and it would fill the pores between adjacent grains of sand and things like that. So there's a bathtub which would represent the granites around the base of the aquifer. And then these basalt lava flows came in millions of years ago and filled that up one layer at a time. But there was a lot of time that happened between one layer and the next layer, so you can imagine how sediment would fall on it, and then a new layer would come in. In our case, the water pretty much exists between the layers of basalt flow. We think about and talk about the aquifer as being two basic aquifer systems, and the Grand Ronde Aquifer is the older aquifer, so it's lower down in the system, and it started coming in about 17 million years ago. And then there was a period of time between the end of the Grand Ronde, when the volcanism stopped, and a different type of volcanism started, which is the Wanapum rock. Before about 1960, Moscow got all of its water out of the upper aquifer. And at some point, they were pumping so much water out of the upper aquifer that the water levels were going down quickly and drastically. And so that's when the communities first got together and said, we need to do something about this because we're going to have a water problem. And so what they did was they drilled some wells into the lower aquifer, and they didn't have to pump as hard out of the upper aquifer. So what you see is, you see the water levels going down really steeply, and then when they drilled wells into the lower aquifer, you see the water levels recover. And so we know that over that period of 10 to 20 years, if you don't pump the upper aquifer, it will recover. The lower aquifer has been going down kind of consistently since we've been measuring back in the 1930s. And we have never taken the pumping pressure off the lower aquifer, so we don't know how long it would take for that to recover. They've done some carbon dating on the lower aquifer, and they've come up with ages in the vicinity of 20,000 years old. So the water, 70% of the water that we're drinking in Moscow is in the vicinity of 20,000 years old. We get about 20 inches or so of precipitation a year in this area. Most of that precipitation gets used by the plants. A lot of the precipitation runs off in the streams. So after the plants use what they need and the streams run off, about 2/10 of an inch gets into the ground every year. At the current population, we're using, by pumping, about 3/10 of an inch. So we're using about 30% more water than we estimate is getting put into the aquifer each year. So in order for us to become sustainable, we'd have to cut our water use by 30%. Right now, the estimates of how much water gets used outdoor every year is around 30% of the total. So in order for us to just instantly make a shot at doing sustainable water use, we'd be banned from using any water outdoors, which means no pools, no tree watering, no parks, none of that stuff. And then we might be able to be sustainable until the next 1,000 people move to town, and the next 1,000, and the next 1,000. It depends on how heavy you water, right? If you put too much water or more water than the plants need, it's going to go down beneath the root zone, and then depending upon the geology beneath that, it may eventually find its way back into the aquifer. But if it hits a clay layer, and there are a lot of clay layers around here, what the water will do is it'll get down, it'll hit a clay layer, and it'll move sideways, and eventually where it hits the surface, it'll run off and go into the streams and leave the area. So overwatering generally doesn't recharge the aquifer. It's either used by the plants, or it comes out in the streams, or it's evaporated later on. I think there are a lot of people who are aware that we're using it in an unsustainable fashion, but they also think that we have a lot of time to deal with the issue. There are a lot of people that think we need to do something right now because we're not using it sustainably. There are a lot of people that don't really think about it. All they do is they get the water bill and they pay the water bill, and when they turn the faucet on, the water comes out, and so they're not too concerned about it. We also have the issue with the university population, which it turns out is kind of a transient population. These students come to town, they're here for 4 years and they leave, and so a lot of them really don't integrate with the community well enough to learn about the major issues that are facing the community while they're here, and that represents a large portion of the people that live here. So we really have inexpensive water now. There's very little treatment, and there's very little cost involved, and so anything that we do involving surface water is going to be a lot more expensive than what we're doing now. People's water bills would go up significantly if we had to switch to a surface water alternative. PBAC is involved in a project where we've hired some consultants who are going back and looking at all the supply alternatives that have been identified over the years, and what kind of other issues, legal issues, environmental issues, water rights issues would we run into if we tried to do those. And then there's the capital costs associated with building things like dams and pipelines and all these storage mechanisms. So it turns out that basically a project that would provide us enough water to last 50 years sustainably from now might cost as much as $50 million. Moscow has a tiered water rate structure, and if you use a lot of water, you pay, I think, almost $4 per unit of water. And so if you don't use a lot of water, you maybe only pay $2 for a unit. And I'm not sure about the exact numbers, but I think that if we move to a surface water alternative, that minimum rate would have to be the same as the maximum rate. So depending upon how much water you used, your rate for water might double.